Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you very much, everyone, and welcome to this webinar, end of project webinar, which is really a chance to take stock of the work that has been done since 2019 on our Irish Research Council Coalesce funded project, Human Trafficking, Forced Migration and Gender Equality in Uganda. We are delighted to have you with us, and it's especially great to have some people who have connected in with the work and contributed to the work over the last few years joining us on the call. And we look forward to hearing some of your insights later. In terms of how the webinar will proceed, we are going to first hear from our three panelists who are each going to share for about 10 minutes each on an aspect of the project. And then we'll hear some reflections from myself and also Dr. David Tshimba, who were research fellows on the project. And then just to close out the hour, we'll have some time for questions or comments. So please do, if you're attending, add your questions and comments in the Q&A box. With us today as panelists, we have, first of all, Professor Chris Dolan. Chris is a Professor of Global Sustainable Development in the School for Cross-Faculty Studies at the University of Warwick. Prior to that, he was the Director of the Refugee Law Project from 2006 to 2022, and was also a former Co-PI on this project, and someone who's been really instrumental from the outset. We also have Ms. Devota Nuwe, who is the Head of Projects at Refugee Law Project, and has also been the interim director of Refugee Law Project and another co-I on the project. And finally, we have Professor Siobhán Mullally, who is an established professor of law at the University of Galway, director of the Irish Centre for Human Rights, and also the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons, especially women and children. So we look forward to hearing insights from all three of you about the project, and also then the broader context within which this project sits, particularly in relation to Professor Mullally's mandate. So we're going to start off with Chris, and really just wanting to hear some insights from you, Chris, in terms of how did this project get started, and what was the sort of genesis of this project, and how did it change how you thought about things in the Refugee Law Project. So if you could just maybe give us a bit of an overview of the project, how it started, and how maybe it started to change things for you within the Refugee Law Project, that would be great. Thank you very much, Chris. I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Gillian, and yeah, it's a pleasure to be on this panel and seeing the project coming to a close. I hope it's the close of this, what becomes a phase in a bigger process. It's been a really important project, I think, both for me personally, but also for Refugee Law Project. And in terms of how it started, you know, I don't remember now whether it was a Zoom call or a phone call or what, but Siobhán Mullally reached out to me. I'd never heard of Siobhán, I'd never heard of the Special Rapporteur in Trafficking, you know, and she reached out and said, would you be interested in doing a joint project? And my first reaction was, what's it got to do with us? And, you know, and when I look back on that, I'm still shocked, really, that I'd been sitting there in Refugee Law Project for 12 years at that point, and the discussion about trafficking had never, not once, kind of registered in any of the conversations that I'd been a part of. And, you know, and I think that is true, that kind of lack of awareness is true in many, many spaces working with forced migrants. And the moment that I started to think about it, the moment we started talking about it, the moment I started looking at definitions of trafficking in persons, well, of course it must be happening. You know, the forced migrants must be the perfect constituency for traffickers. It's one of the best places possible to find people with the right kinds of vulnerabilities, the right kind of needs, to be able to draw them into trafficking circumstances. And so it really took Siobhán, I think, all of about 30 seconds to persuade me that there was actually a connection to be made. and I think we then spent quite some time, also trying to then map out who are the different stakeholders that need to be drawn into that conversation. Obviously, Siobhán had a lot of connections beforehand, and we were able to build on those. We started to build new connections through the project. But the core question for myself, and I think for Refugee Law Project as well, not having, prior to this, having been not looking for forced trafficking in person amongst the forced migrants that we were working with, was how do we start to actually identify forced migrants who are also victims of trafficking in persons. And that process took us quite a long time to work out, because it's one of those topics that nobody really wants to talk about. And so we really struggled for quite a long time to work out how do we demonstrate that something which, when we think about it, it's obvious it must be hidden in plain sight. How do we actually bring that thing which is hidden in plain sight into view in a way that makes sense to the people that need to know? So how do we develop an evidence base? And I think for me that was a really kind of a key part of this project, and an outcome actually, was that we eventually worked out as Refugee Law Project that, like so many other difficult topics, we have to approach it somewhat indirectly, and not start by asking about trafficking, but rather start by asking about some of the things that might indicate trafficking, that might signal to us that there could be an issue here. And in that, it was so, and how we did that was we built in these a bunch of questions about those kind of indicators into a bigger screening process that we had already established and was quite well developed. And that screening, thankfully, is ongoing, because a new grant was given. And so hopefully that will yield a more quantitative sense of the extent to which these kind of trafficking scenarios can actually be found within refugee populations if you just ask the right questions. So yeah, it's been an interesting journey. And I think for me, one of the things that I think is also interesting about it is the parallels that are clear with other questions where getting the evidence is difficult because the issue is stigmatized. So the parallels with the work that we did as Refugee Law Project on sexual violence against men, and how do we find questions that people can answer without, they answer rather than running off into the distance because they don't want to be asked the things that will put them at risk. It also paralleled our work on what we started to talk about as hidden disabilities. So when we started to try and understand much better what are the intersections between disability and forced migration, we had a similar set of problems that, there are a few things that are known and that are visible and that are counted. And then there are many other things that should be under the same umbrella that are not known, and that are not visible, and are not being counted, and that really pose us challenges as practitioners, as policymakers, as researchers, because we're essentially doing all our work in a bit of an evidence vacuum. So that to me has been a very interesting part of the project. And as you do that kind of work, you start to realize that maybe the stakeholders that you've been trying to engage with they're not the only ones. There should be other stakeholders. So I believe there's a briefing paper coming out shortly from a policy workshop dialogue that was held recently in Kampala, and where the Ministry of Health was invited, or it was recognized that if they were not there, they should be there, because some of the kind of key indicators of experiences of trafficking are actually, the entry point is medical. I don't believe, and Siobhán maybe will correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe that at the beginning of the project, we were trying to get Ministry of Health into our workshops. And there have been workshops throughout the project. And yet again, it's one of those things where once you know, when I think about it now, it's like, well, goodness, that's so obvious, but it wasn't obvious. It's that, you know, so kind of working out how these things develop, it can take quite some time. And I think for me, and I'll close now, but one of the challenges that comes out of it all is that once you start to, once you start to include constituencies that up to a certain point have been ignored, sidelined, you end up destabilizing the very framework into which you're seeking to include them. So that's, I think in a sense, that's what's happening here, is that we had a framework, there's a protocol, there's whatever Uganda has put in place. There was a team of, or like a landscape of stakeholders that were seen as relevant. And as we have gone further into exploring the issues, that landscape is shifting. And the people that are seen as relevant and necessary to really actually make it possible to make sure that the provisions of different laws are put in place, that the rights of trafficked persons are protected. That landscape is changing, and that creates a whole new bunch of challenges, because it's a shifting, it's a moving landscape, but that's also what makes it so interesting. So let me close there. I mean, I hope I've given a sense of how, it was very much an exploration, and I will always thank Siobhán for inviting us to open our eyes, and then working with us to really try and see what we could see once we had opened our eyes. And I very much hope that the process will go forward. I do think that, like those other issues I mentioned, there is still a massive data gap and an evidence gap. And like all those kind of issues, it's not because it's not happening, it's because we don't know how to evidence it, and we really have to tackle that properly. So let me stop there. Thank you very much indeed, Gillian.
Thank you so much, Chris. They're really helpful insights. And I think something that really struck me from what you said is just that, coming from that very first conversation of thinking, what on earth has that got to do with us, to where we are now, where it's so very clear that it's got everything to do with RLP and refugee protection. And I know that will come out through the webinar, but I think just one of the crucial things that has happened during the life of this project is just that connection being made. And then, as you say, moves towards looking for it, and the development of screening questions and indicators, and a real concerted effort to look for those indicators of trafficking, and to actually look for what is essentially hidden in plain sight. So thank you so much for those insights of kind of where it started from, and also maybe some of the things that we need to continue doing. I'm going to turn now to Devota and just really ask you to let us know, maybe, I mean, we've heard a little bit from Chris, maybe where some of the things, where we are now, where we weren't even thinking that we would end up, or maybe some of the highlights through the project of some of the things that have happened, some of the achievements, and just generally where the picture is now at the end of the project. So Devota, will be really helpful and great to hear your insights as a co-PI on this project. So I will hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gillian. Good afternoon, everyone. Greetings from Kampala. The project was very insightful when it comes to human trafficking. Uganda hosts 1.5 million refugees, and we have very many new arrivals still coming from the Democratic Republic of Congo and also South Sudan. And when you look, as Chris mentioned previously, when you're looking at refugees, you'd not really think that there would be a fertile ground to be trafficked to other communities, but then it actually makes sense when you think about it. And as we explored and went on with the project, we started reaching out to different stakeholders. We reached out to UNHCR, reached out to the Directorate of Public Prosecution, and there are massive gaps on data. But also we realized that there are some soft points when it comes to human trafficking among refugees. And when we were talking to refugees in the settlements, we realized that one of the soft points when it comes to human trafficking is education, because most of the refugees lack education, they have unemployment. So you find that it's easy for traffickers to use those gaps to actually traffic human beings. So when we're in Chiriandongo, we had about two sets of refugees who are promised scholarships. One was scholarships in Kampala, and the parents willingly handed over to this Good Samaritan for them to have education in Kampala. Also, the same thing is when children are promised education in South Sudan, and then caregivers willingly hand over their children, but when they don't even bother to have any background information. So you find that children are especially vulnerable when it comes to human trafficking. And then also another category that we found through our research that are vulnerable to human trafficking are women. And this is mostly in trade. We found that many of in the informal sector, the women who work in homes as housemaids, as laborers, and then those who work in hotels, you find that they have been trafficked, they have been promised jobs, but when they get there, they are exploited and you don't know what happens. So in terms of trafficking, we saw that the trafficking among refugees is happening both within Uganda and also out of Uganda. But as I said, that the statistics are low. So when it comes to refugees, it's a vulnerable group. We discussed with UNHCR and we looked at maybe perhaps forming a technical working group specifically on human trafficking and making sure that we keep sharing data and information. So as the project started, I know we are reporting about the end of the project, but we still have a lot to achieve. So if there is a technical working group when it comes to human trafficking, then we can share information. And then also another point that came out in the human trafficking research is in terms of translation when it comes to the recognition, even the identification. For someone to know that an act is human trafficking, they may see it as a Good Samaritan deed. So just letting people know that they are exploited and there is actually an early warning when it comes to human trafficking is something that we realize. And then one thing that I want to mention is that we asked the government, the Directorate of Prosecution, to share with us statistics when it comes to refugees. And I think they had just 3 people who they had suspected had been trafficked. But this is, of course, very small compared to the 1.5 million refugees that we host in Uganda. So we still have a lot to do when it comes to capacity building, when it comes to information sharing. We still have a lot of work ahead of us. And in terms of advocacy, we need to share short messages and translate forms of human trafficking in local languages, in the different refugee languages, for refugees to understand that they are actually victims of human trafficking. I think that would actually help spread awareness and have prevention. And then also another weakness that we had was in terms of response. After we received reports of human trafficking, what happens? We found that there is a lot of lack of capacity. We've been doing trainings and we got a lot of requests from the police, from the Directorate of Public Prosecution to conduct trainings for their staff members so that they know about human rights, they know about refugees, they know about human trafficking. I think this would really help when it comes to identification, advocacy, and spreading the word. So that is what I want to share, but thank you so much for joining us, and I look forward to hearing questions more about our research. Over to you, Gillian.
Thank you so much, Devota. And just as Devota says about questions, just to remind our attendees that there is a Q&A function. So if you have any questions or comments or something that you'd like our panelists to elaborate on later, do feel free to put your questions in the chat box and we will pick them up. And thank you also, Devota, just for highlighting some of those key findings of kind of whenever we got deeper into some of the issues, realizing even more, the complexity of what was happening and how much more coordination and capacity is needed. And also that idea of understanding what is human trafficking, not just translating linguistically, but also translating meaning in a culturally relevant way, I think is something that has really come out as a really important theme and something that probably needs to be taken forward. So thank you very much. I'm now going to turn to Siobhán, Professor Siobhán Mullally, who is a UN Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons, including or especially women and children. We have a bit of technical difficulty, so unfortunately we can't see Siobhán, but hopefully we can still hear her. And really, Siobhán, I just want to turn to you and ask you about how all of this work that's been happening in the project, obviously you've been a Co-PI since the start right through to the end, but also in your role as a special rapporteur, and that link between what's happening in this project and what's happening in Uganda, but then more the global picture. And I know that you are presenting a report to the Human Rights Council this month on the intersections between trafficking and asylum. And it's great to see that emphasis at a more global level. So perhaps you could speak to how all of this fits in to the broader global picture and really where we go from here. So I'll hand over to you, Siobhán. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I'm sorry, I'm not sure, I haven't been able to fix the technical issue with regard to the camera, and I'm reluctant to log out in case I lose you completely, but I hope you can hear me loud and clear. I want to go back perhaps to Chris's opening comment about I contacted Chris and Refugee Law Project out of the blue pre the COVID-19 pandemic to look at the possibility of a partnership drawing on the Irish Research Council and Irish Aid's new Coalesce funding opportunity, which was looking at how to draw on research and policy-oriented research to inform the work of some of Irish Aid's priority country programs, and particularly to look within their thematic focus, including on gender equality, on conflict and security, and human rights. And when I was reading that and looking at that, the Refugee Law Project was the potential partner that came to mind. Although Chris had never heard of me, I had heard of Chris and of the Refugee Law Project work. I'd always used the Refugee Law Project's work in my teaching, and particularly it seemed to be the appropriate partner because of the work that was ongoing, very innovative work on sexual violence and conflict, on looking at the particular experiences of refugee communities who may have experienced sexual violence in conflict and displacement, and the important attention that was given to trauma-informed approaches to investigation, to reporting, to developing safe spaces for disclosure and providing supports, and linking that into a whole range of support works, including it could be referrals for medical assistance, healthcare, psychosocial assistance, the mental health programs, or at very practical levels, the English language teaching, the skills development programs and employment pathways, and how those were used to build trust, to then try to promote awareness of human rights violations that had occurred and look at opportunities to assist people in recovering and moving on or moving forward despite those experiences. Uganda, as Devota said, is a country that hosts 1.5 million refugees, has high numbers of internally displaced persons, has a long history of hosting refugees, including welcoming again refugees during the COVID-19 pandemic from Eastern GRC, from South Sudan. And so it seemed to me to be a place where it would be really important to try to explore these questions. As Chris said, it was about asking the right kind of questions, building this into existing work. And there, again, in the Ugandan context, you had the attention to women, peace and security, the post-conflict context, all of the work that Refugee Law Project has been doing on transitional justice and memory and reconciliation. And there again, in those spaces, we don't see attention being given to trafficking in persons. So it has been very surprising to me, for example, that in women, peace and security discussions or in transitional justice discussions, the different forms of trafficking that take place in conflict and that can undermine peace building are not really addressed. So it was about trying to move beyond those different silos, and Refugee Law Project seemed to me to be a really important partner in already having done so much work in breaking down silos in responses to situations of serious human rights violations and really engaging with a range of concerns around refugee protection. As you said, Gillian, this is a priority area for my mandate. I am presenting a report. It's called a thematic report to the Human Rights Council on June 28th. I do reference the work of the Refugee Law Project there as an example where significant work was done to bring in a process of asking questions through screening processes and looking at ways in which trust could be built so that there was more reporting and recognition of trafficking occurring in refugee settings. And there, that was to try to move beyond what we had seen, where the attention to trafficking has been very much through a criminal justice lens, perhaps still remaining within the framework of the Palermo Protocol. And although there's a whole range of significant developments within the wider international human rights law, it hasn't translated very much into changes in practice in humanitarian or refugee settings. So that's where I think the experience of the partnership with Refugee Law Project has been critically important. Even the insights, as Devota mentioned, that we got from the visits and the engagement and the presentations in Kiria and Dongo earlier this year, where partners presented on the work that was done in translation and interpreting the terms used on trafficking, to make those more meaningful to different contexts, to the experiences of refugees and internally displaced persons, to recognize the informality that can sometimes be linked to trafficking, rather than always thinking about organized criminal transnational networks, to recognize that there may be a level of informality engaging communities, family members, deceiving people into thinking they were receiving a scholarship, an education opportunity, a job offer, but then ending up in a situation of sexual exploitation. What was also, I think, really important was to find different ways of talking about that, given the continuing stigma, shame, the reluctance to discuss these experiences and risks, and the importance of finding ways to safely report these. But then what would happen next? What were the referral pathways? What assistance could be provided? What services and supports were in place? And that has been very important in other country settings where I've had meetings or discussions to try to look at what's happening. And with Refugee Law Project, we've also engaged with the Global Protection Cluster, the Anti-Trafficking Task Team, and trying to look at how to build in a focus on and attention to human trafficking in protection clusters. So whether it's looking at child protection or gender-based violence, that they can also integrate work on trafficking there. But it was also important to recognize what was being missed. So the experiences of men and boys and their, Refugee Law Project has been groundbreaking in terms of looking at those silences, those gaps in terms of protection work, and looking at wider labor exploitation settings, labor externalization, perhaps targeting refugee communities or informal day labor situations that become exploitative, that these were not being captured by protection clusters, and also that large refugee settlements or communities become a target because people are in a prolonged vulnerable situation due to the displacement, due to loss of livelihoods or family networks. And there, Uganda's approach in terms of the prima facie status and refugee recognition was really important in reducing vulnerability. At the same time, that raised questions as to, when were humanitarian actors or protection actors going to screen or look at possible indicators of trafficking and risks of trafficking. So the importance of building that into protection assistance and screening processes. And again, just to go back to Devota and Chris's points around the different kinds of stakeholders we've engaged with. And certainly at the start, we hadn't thought about healthcare professionals, the healthcare sector, informal healthcare workers, who in fact are critically important and can be the first point of contact and really key partners in identifying a risk of trafficking or an experience of trafficking, and being able to provide some initial assistance and support, and being very much to the fore in recognizing this. Child protection actors, teachers, those involved in labour inspectorates or trade unions, labour rights, workers' associations. So again, trying to move out of the traditional focus on criminal justice actors to engage a much wider range of stakeholders. And that applies also with regard to civil society, because typically, and this is the case internationally, NGOs working on refugee protection, refugee rights, migration, or more broadly on international human rights law, do not look at trafficking in persons. And there's somewhat of a reluctance to engage for a range of different reasons. So I think it's really important to also move outside of the very narrow kind of self-referential trafficking community and to engage much more widely with a wider range of civil society and policy actors. So those are a few key points I'll be discussing at the Human Rights Council in June, and hopefully we can continue this work in other settings as well. Over to you, Gillian. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Siobhán, just for those really insightful comments, and sorry that we can't see you. But yeah, just again, really similar themes coming out across all three of our panelists. This idea of even just giving attention to this issue is such a sort of new or pioneering thing to do outside of the kind of narrow silo within which it's usually dealt with. So, and I think, from all three panelists, what we've heard is as that attention has been given, all of a sudden all these interconnecting and intersecting issues and thematic areas that perhaps we hadn't expected to see came through, whether that be, healthcare, as Siobhán also mentioned, labour externalisation and labour laws. We also had started to look at also the intersections with climate change, on displacement and kind of vulnerability, and just how entangled all of these issues are, and how it seems it's no longer appropriate to only look at human trafficking, in a siloed way. And that's really come through the work of the project, and kind of just broadening out those ideas of who needs to be in the room, stakeholders, but who we need to engage, and what thematic areas are important. So thank you so much, Siobhán. And I think it's really important to hear that actually the work that's happening in Uganda is also linking into broader global discussions about how to address this problem, and just connecting this project to some of the wider work. I'm just going to turn now to David, who was a research fellow on the project. Chris, I see that you have your hand raised, so I'll come back to you in a moment. But I'm just going to turn to David, maybe just for some reflections on what our panelists have said, or anything else that you would like to add about the project. So I'll hand over to you now, David.
Thank you so very much, Gillian, and thank you so much, our panelists, for what has been said. We've been in the trenches with Gillian as research fellows to this policy research, and it has been a great deal of learning. We at Refugee Law Project and broadly in Uganda, we are celebrated for having a Refugee Act, which is a cornerstone legislation of great progressive stance on many fronts. But it just occurred to me after taking up the position of researching policy-wise on the question of human trafficking that I couldn't believe my cursory look at the Refugee Act, for example, a 37-page legislation, a piece of legislation which is very insightful, very forward-looking in so many regards, has no word trafficking in it. And for me, this is a very telling realization. Refugee Act, progressive as it does not have trafficking in it. So, of course, far from blaming the thinkers of the Refugee Act, far from apportioning blame to the OPM, I think the whole assumption of refugees as alien, dealt with under a department under the Office of the Prime Minister, called the Department of Refugees, sees them as people who are the receiving end of care, and trafficking cannot cross their mind. So the shock which Chris had when that phone call or the email from Siobhán came, it has its siblings. That shock has its siblings and its grandfathers and its parents in many places around Uganda. So it's not Chris' shock. It is our global shock. So that for me, it's a very interesting realization as a research fellow. A second one now, even more telling, is that as we went in implementing the act, enacting the act, 3 years down the road, we have Prevention of Trafficking in Persons Act, which comes 3 years. We have built a very important constituency of forced migrants in the country. We are getting closer to 800,000 by 2009. But the entire act of prevention of trafficking in persons has no refugee word in it. There's no refugee word in it. And for me, that is a wow. Again, the underlying assumption or the undergirding presumption in that act is that it deals with nationals. TIP, as we know it, managed from Ginger Road, Ministry of Internal Affairs. You read nationals and national in it. Refugees managed from Old Kampala are dealing with aliens, and Old Kampala and Ginger Road, geographically, they don't cross, they don't meet anywhere. Unless there is a roundabout, probably closer to Kampala Road. But we don't have any intersection between folks who are very much engaging in preventing or trafficking in the name of the act, have no idea about refuge, have no idea about refugees, have no idea about forced displacement. And yet, as Chris rightly said, a very fertile nursery bed for the traffickers. For me, those two realizations became for me a big lesson that there is not just a problem with practice and the implementation, as we are fond of saying, Ugandan problem is that lack of implementation of the law, but the problem is primarily a lack of awareness at the conception level of the legislation itself. So we shouldn't be jumping on the easily identifiable challenge of practice is a problem, but even conception, I mean, the abstraction is a problem. And for me, that has not really come out very strongly in our litany of problems with our society. We think the law is okay, and its application is a problem. And yes, it isn't. The third point, as a research fellow on this project, was that again, that realization, which is it's not just mine, it is another learning by doing, and also learning from different people, that the dearth of data and the dearth of metrics as we have it is engendered by another critical problem, which is identification and documentation. And if you push a little further, why is it difficult to identify and document those identified? You will see that there is a disinvestment in enablers of disclosure. And there is a systemic disinvestment in enabling disclosure about trafficking. So victims and survivors of it hardly come forward, and they hardly come forward because there is hardly an incentive for them to come forward, which again leads to a bigger realization, which 3 years of doing this has taught us, that unless there are guarantees of adequate response to those who will have, to those to whom disclosure will have been enabled, then there's nowhere near you will get around a sense of extent to which this crisis is really happening. And so the fact that we do not have what I call the software aid, psychosocial, and the hardware aid, the livelihood to those who have survived trafficking or potentially about to be trafficked, makes it all the more difficult to even start dreaming of reliable data, let alone robust. And finally, as we thought of trafficking for what it is so serious a business to be left to prosecutors alone. Combating trafficking is serious a matter to be left to legal, policy, and perhaps a little bit of civil society actors alone. We realize that we need to bring many more on board to approach it from a nexus viewpoint, not as compartmentalized. Then our very last dialogue brought in private sector, for example. And for me, it was a very important buffet to have a representative from the Uganda Hotel Owners Association in the room. The discussion changed fundamentally when we had the intervention from those in the tourist and hospitality industry speaking. And they are driven by maximization of profit, and they are striving for cheaper labor. How else can you get cheaper labor if not through exploitation? A perfect common denominator of trafficking. And so unless we bring the private into this otherwise states and civil society dominated conversation, we are far from fighting such a crime which thrive on particular modes of production, capitalist modes of production. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David, and really great to have your insights. And again, just I think highlighting not only the kind of thematic fragmentation that we're talking about, that question of, well, what has this got to do with anything, but even some of the roots, either some of the causes, but maybe also consequences of that, are the fragmentation in the legislation, but also institutional fragmentation, the fact that, and you highlighted there, that, different government departments are dealing with these, and, as you say, just even geographically and location-wise, I think so much fragmentation, and so much of this has just been about trying to bring those actors together and see those connections. So I think you really highlighted that, this siloing is taking place not just in our own discourses, but also, in law, policy, and practice. And I think so much of this has just been about moving beyond that. And then from that, paying attention to it means that we then start to look for it. And then I think when we start to look for it, we realize how much we don't know, and then how many other interconnecting issues have come. So I think that's probably, you know, where we are at the moment is then moving forward from where we are. Like as all of our speakers have said, there's so much more to be done. It feels like we've just now scratched the surface. I do want to open up for some questions or comments, but I do want to turn back to Chris, who's raised his hand. Maybe just if you want to give some comments or insights, that would be great. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Gillian. And I'm looking at the Q&A and I don't see any questions. So let me just ask a question, if I may. I mean, it seems to me, you know, in my remarks, I said, I mean, what happens once you start including ignored populations is you actually end up destabilizing the thing that you're trying to include them in. And, you know, I personally, I think that's a very healthy process. I think the project has done that to a certain, you know, has begun that process, if you like, of destabilizing the existing framework. And we've heard it in terms of now in David's remarks about the Hotel Owners Association are now in the room, and it changes the conversation. We've got the Ministry of Health in the room. So in a way, we have what I would describe as a relatively bottom-up kind of destabilization process. And I wondered if I could put the question to Siobhán, because we haven't had a chance to talk about it. How are you looking at that kind of destabilization moving upwards, so that when you talk in New York and in your capacity as special rapporteur, you know, are you seeing any signs? And if you are, what are your indicators that there is some flexibility and that people are beginning to see, not just from a ground level in Uganda, but more globally, that, as you very well put it, you know, the kind of this obsession with criminal justice and making sure that the policies and the laws are implemented to try and promote a criminal justice approach to trafficking. To what extent is that shifting? And this wider lens that we've started to explore through this project, you know, is it getting any traction further up, you know, at the kind of global level in which you also operate?
Yeah, if that's okay, Gillian, I'll step in. Yeah. Thank you very much to Chris for the question. And I think there's still a lot of work to be done. What's interesting to me is that when I start to try to have conversations or open up meetings, that it's still the case that quite often the response is, well, we don't work on human trafficking. And that may be from an embassy, it may be from a large NGO or from a UN agency. And these, you know, are actors that are working on sexual violence or gender-based violence, that are working on international humanitarian law and human rights violations in conflict settings or in humanitarian settings. And I think it is partly because it has been siloed somewhat in the criminal justice context. And the main NGO, UNODC, works very closely with justice sector actors. But there you also see UNODC, for example, engaging much more broadly, certainly at a global level, at headquarters level, on conflict situations, on victims' rights, on issues around climate change and displacement, for example. But in practice, there's still an awful lot of work to do. And what I've seen also is that there is some reluctance that trafficking is seen as being about sexual exploitation, primarily about discussions in relation to regulation of sex work or prostitution. And some NGOs, some actors want to stay away from that or think it's a particularly specialized question that isn't within their remit or work. So they don't, there's still a lot of work, I think, to make the connections into broader child protection, including with the key kind of actors involved in that in development or humanitarian settings, and also with the kind of donor governments and various partners. So it's a lot of work to be done. There's some recognition and acceptance of that, and similar kinds of responses. Oh, we hadn't thought about it in that way, or kind of abductions for the purpose of child marriage, or children disappearing, ending up, you know, married, inverted commas, or in situations, as Devota said, of domestic servitude, and then perhaps child or forced marriage, and perhaps sexual exploitation, that they're not yet fully seen as trafficking. But there is quite a bit of work on the kind of children and conflict context in recognizing it, that is being accepted. But I think to translate that into practice requires a lot more persistent effort, and maybe clear policy documents, legal instruments to address that, you know, so that it doesn't become just dependent on one person asking the questions, that it becomes more systemically incorporated into everyday work. So if you look at the UNHCR guidelines on international protection and trafficking, they date from 2006. The focus is primarily on women and sexual exploitation, but there are later guidelines on child asylum, for example, or on, you know, organized violence, that can be used to address situations around access to asylum for victims of trafficking. But much more comprehensive kind of approach is needed. Also to highlight the work of UN human rights treaty bodies, and to get UN agencies and NGOs, a much broader kind of range of NGOs looking at this issue, so that it doesn't become limited. There's, you know, a very good group of civil society actors working on trafficking, but it doesn't tend to get broadened out into engagement with other types of NGOs in the human rights space. And that's a challenge, I think. And it's maybe, as you said, one that we see in other contexts on disability rights, or even perhaps initially, you know, refugee questions being primarily refugee organizations, but not seen more broadly as raising human rights law questions, international humanitarian law and policy questions as well. So it's to consistently break that down, but I think there's some openness to it, but it's kind of translating it into practice. Then the next stage is more challenging.
Thanks so much, Siobhán. Really helpful insights from that kind of global level as well. I see we have 4 questions in the chat, and we've got about 5 minutes left, so we'll try and be speedy to get through them all. I'll maybe pose one to each of our panelists. So we've got Dora, who's asking, how active is RLP in engaging with COP-TIPS? So for those who aren't from Uganda, that's the Coordination Office for Prevention Against Trafficking in Persons, and also the Uganda Civil Society Coalition Against Trafficking in Persons. And this person notes there's quite some work being done on TIP across the country, but also requires different thematic actors to actively engage. And of course, these stakeholders we haven't mentioned too explicitly through this webinar, but you know, both of them, certainly there's been a lot of connection through the project, for which we're really grateful for. And you know, the Coalition on Trafficking Against Persons has been very engaged. But I'll maybe give that question to Devota to answer in more detail, if that's okay. I'll maybe just go through them all now, and then we can just go through our panelists. We have another question here from Gillian, and I think I'll pose this to Chris. So Gillian saying, you know, it's very interesting to hear from Chris about these intersections of forced migration, trafficking, disability, and you know, this is another group that's hidden, not known, not counted. So how do we include those, especially less visible or those with invisible disabilities? And you know, is there an additional aspect of stigma in Uganda related to disability and trafficking? And you know, how do we then include this in terms of screening and inclusion to increase their visibility and, you know, special protection needs? So Chris, perhaps you could speak a little bit to that. And then a couple more questions. So from Dennis asking, you know, what explains the fact that Uganda's laws acknowledge refugees and trafficking but are not linked between the two? Are there moments when the government has dealt with cases involved with trafficking of refugees? And Perhaps again, you know, David, if you are able to speak to that, I can also say that this is not something that, you know, that institutional and legislative fragmentation is not something that's unique to Uganda, but as Siobhán has mentioned, we're global. And then we've got a question from Favor Ofia, who is saying, in terms of crossing the silos and diversifying these perspectives, what has been the reaction of partners and constituents in Uganda? Can you say that there's a growing acceptance of the need to harmonise these approaches, and where do you see this going in the future? And perhaps Siobhán, if you're happy to answer that one, and then we'll see where we get to by then. And we might be just about out of time, but we can always close the webinar and hang around for some other questions. So I'm sort of flying through those questions, but I'll turn to Devota first then for the question about sort of engaging with COP-TIP and UCATIP.
Thank you, Siobhán, and thank you, Gillian, and thank you, Dora, for that question. COP-TIP, we are involved in COP-TIP, and we are a member of COP-TIP. And at the beginning of the project, we had to introduce ourselves and let COP-TIP members know that there is a gap. So we are right now involved in, and one of the key gaps realized was on identification and then in advocacy. So we are working together with COP-TIP, and we are looking at the different thematic actors. And when it comes to the actors, when it comes to forced migration, the key actors are UNHCR, the Directorate of Public Prosecution, and then the police. Those are the key actors when it comes to response and prevention. And we are certainly engaging with all these groups. But as I said, the project was for 3 years, and we opened up a lot of questions, and we're going to continue doing the work with COP-TIP. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Chris, I'll maybe hand over to you then for Keelan's question about kind of hidden disabilities.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And thanks, Gillian, for the question. I'm not sure I can answer it very well. I think it comes back to the question of, you know, which was reinforced in David's presentation about there's a fundamental problem with how we conceptualize disability. And, you know, until you've kind of got that conceptual question a bit clearer, it's quite difficult to answer this one, because to me, this kind of comes downstream from having an answer to that question. You know, in our work, we were trying to get people, it's a different project, but where we were trying to get people to think about disability and forced migration and hidden disability